She stood alone in a wedding dress, smiling at a camera while her heart shattered with every click. The man she was supposed to marry, thousands of miles away, wearing a uniform instead of a tuxedo, answering to duty instead of I do. But what happened years later, when she returned to that same studio to finally let go, will make you question everything you thought you knew about love and timing. Here's the truth. Nobody wants to tell you. Sometimes the people we love most have to choose something bigger than us, and we're left standing there holding on to promises that feel more like ghosts than guarantees. You've been taught that love conquers all, that if it's meant to be, it'll happen, that good things come to those who wait. But what they don't tell you is how long wait actually means, or what it costs to hold on to hope when everyone around you has already moved on. She did everything right. She kept faith. She stayed loyal. She believed in homecoming. And it still wasn't enough to bring him back. At least not when she needed him most. Most people would call her crazy for taking wedding photos alone. They'd say she should have canceled, should have moved on, should have found someone who could actually show up. But here's what makes this story different. What makes it cut deeper than those viral military reunion videos you scroll past. She didn't just wait for him to come home. She learned to live in the space between goodbye and hello, between sacrifice and fulfillment, between the uniform folded on the chair and the man who'd wear it again. And when she finally decided to close that chapter, when she walked back into that studio years later ready to release what she'd been holding on to, that's when the impossible walked through the door. Because sometimes the universe doesn't give you what you want when you want it. Sometimes it waits until you're strong enough to receive it, until you've earned the ending by surviving the middle. There's something haunting about standing in front of a camera when the person you're supposed to be beside isn't there. The uniform folded on the chair back home, his boots by the door. These weren't just objects. They were promises. She'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but never alone. The wind caught her veil like it was trying to carry a message somewhere far away, maybe to wherever deployment had taken him. Every click of the shutter felt like a tiny betrayal, like she was documenting a future that hadn't arrived yet. You see, sacrifice isn't just what happens on distant soil under a flag on the table. It's also what happens in a photography studio on a Tuesday afternoon when you smile through the ache because you made a vow, not at an altar, but in a letter he wrote before his orders came through. She didn't cry, not visibly. That's the thing about duty and love. They teach you to hold your spine straight, even when your heart is folding in on itself. The photographer kept saying beautiful, but she wasn't sure if he meant the dress or the lie she was telling with her eyes. What people don't understand about honor is that sometimes it looks like this. A woman in white, pretending the empty space beside her is just bad composition. She could have postponed it, sure. But homecoming is never guaranteed, and she'd learned that hope doesn't wait for perfect timing. So she stood there, letting the camera capture what her heart couldn't hold anymore. The weight of waiting, dressed up as a wedding day. And somewhere between the third and fourth shot, she started to wonder if love could survive being a photograph before it ever became a memory. Nights have a way of stretching when you're waiting for someone who might not come back. She'd wake up at 3 a.m. and reach across the bed, forgetting for just a second that deployment doesn't end because you miss someone hard enough. The dress hung in the closet like a question mark, wrapped in plastic, gathering dust and doubts in equal measure. Friends would ask her at coffee shops, at grocery stores, in passing, "So when's the big day?" And she'd smile, that smile you learn when the mission has no return date. Eventually, they stopped asking, and that silence hurt worse than the questions ever did. You know how some people collect stamps or coins? She collected letters, not the kind you frame, the kind you read, until the edgeth fray and the ink smudges from your thumbs. Each one signed the same way. "Until I'm home." 3 words that became her anchor and her torture. Sacrifice isn't always this big cinematic thing with flag-draped ceremonies and parades. Sometimes it's just a Tuesday, where you eat dinner alone again, where his boots by the door become a shrine you dust around but never move. Sometimes honor looks like setting the table for two out of habit, then putting one plate back. What they don't tell you about waiting is that it changes you in ways deployment changes a soldier. You become someone who checks her phone compulsively, who knows the sound of every car engine on the street, who's memorized the pattern of how bad news gets delivered. The uniform folded on the chair in her bedroom wasn't just fabric. It was the last thing she saw him wear before he became a voice on a crackling line, before he became months on a calendar she was afraid to flip. Love, she learned, isn't just about being together. Sometimes it's about surviving the apart, about carrying someone's absence like it weighs the same as their presence. And as another season turned without him, she started to understand that duty and love weren't opposites. They were two halves of the same unbearable truth. Years have a funny way of teaching you when to let go, even when every cell in your body is still holding on. She walked back into that same photography studio with a different kind of courage. Not the kind that waits, but the kind that releases. The flag on the table in her living room had become more symbol than hope, and she'd finally made peace with the idea that some stories don't get the ending you write in your head. The photographer recognized her immediately, didn't ask questions, just nodded with the kind of understanding that comes from witnessing too many unfinished narratives. This time, she told herself, the photo would be for closure, not for waiting. Here's what nobody tells you about moving forward. It doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like betrayal. She stood in the same spot where she'd stood years ago. Older now, steadier, but carrying every single day of that weight in her bones. The light fell differently this time. Softer, maybe, or perhaps she was just softer. The photographer adjusted the lens, talking about angles and exposure. But she wasn't really listening. She was busy having a conversation with the version of herself who'd stood here before, promising that ghost that this wasn't giving up. It was just learning how to breathe again. Duty and love had taught her to be strong, but they'd never taught her how to be strong enough to say goodbye. Then something shifted in the air. You know that feeling when the whole room changes temperature and you can't explain why? She saw it first in the reflection of the photographer's lens, a shadow that didn't belong to the equipment, a silhouette that her heart recognized before her eyes could focus. The uniform, those shoulders, that specific way of standing that only comes from months of mission, discipline, and the weight of orders carried out. Her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her ribs, and for a second she thought maybe grief had finally learned to play tricks on her in broad daylight. But then she heard it, his boots by the door, that unmistakable sound of leather on hardwood, the rhythm of homecoming she'd memorized from dreams, but never thought she'd hear in waking life. There are moments in life when your body knows something before your mind catches up, when your heart starts racing before you've even turned around. She froze, not from fear, but from the terrifying possibility that if she moved too fast, the moment might shatter like glass. His boots echoed again, closer this time, each step a punctuation mark on a sentence she'd been waiting years to finish. The photographer had gone completely silent, camera lowered, smart enough to recognize when he was witnessing something bigger than a photo session. She could feel him behind her now, close enough that the air between them felt charged, like the space right before lightning decides where to strike. You see, homecoming isn't always this loud, celebratory thing you see in viral videos. Sometimes it's quiet as a prayer, fragile as a first breath after being underwater too long. She turned slowly, and there he was. Not a memory, not a photograph, not a voice on a crackling line from somewhere she couldn't pronounce. Real, solid, alive. His face was different, older in ways that had nothing to do with years, and everything to do with things he'd seen. Things that leave marks you can't photograph. The uniform he wore wasn't the same one folded on the chair back home. This one had been places, carried the weight of duty and love in equal measure, bore the kind of wrinkles that come from sleeping in places that don't deserve to be called beds. No words came. Not at first. Words felt too small, too clumsy for what was happening between them. Instead, there was just breathing two people, remembering how to exist in the same room. The same moment, the same frame after years of being separated by orders and oceans and the kind of sacrifice nobody talks about at dinner parties. A single tear traced down her cheek, and he lifted his hand slowly, like he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast, and caught it with his thumb. That touch, that simple gesture after years of absence, said everything that deployment had stolen from them. I'm here. I'm real. I came back. The flag on the table at home had kept its promise after all. But standing there, she realized honor wasn't just about what he'd done overseas. It was also about what they'd both survived while he was gone. The photographer lifted his camera again, but this time his hands were shaking, not from nerves, but from the privilege of capturing something most people spend their whole lives searching for. The shutter clicked, and the sound was completely different now. No longer lonely, no longer documenting absence, dressed up as presence. His arm wrapped around her waist, and she felt the warmth of it sink through the fabric of her dress, through her skin, straight into the places that had gone cold during the wait. This wasn't the perfect wedding photo she'd imagined years ago. His uniform was wrinkled from travel, her makeup was smudged from tears. The lighting wasn't quite right. But earned things are never perfect. They're just real. Here's what sacrifice actually looks like when it comes full circle. It looks like two people standing in a frame that had been empty for so long it forgot what it was supposed to hold. The uniform folded on the chair back home would soon have company. His boots by the door would finally make sense again, paired instead of singular, arrival instead of artifact. The flag on the table wouldn't be a symbol of waiting anymore. It would just be a flag, honored but no longer holding the entire weight of hope on its fabric. Every letter he'd written, every mission he'd completed, every order he'd followed, every moment of duty and love, pulling him in opposite directions. It all led here, to this photograph, to this woman, to this homecoming that nobody had guaranteed. Years apart don't just disappear because someone comes home, they become part of the story, woven into the fabric of what comes next. The photo captured them not as they were, but as they'd become. Stronger in the broken places, wiser about what honor actually costs, humbler about what love can survive. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her. And in that exchange was every goodbye they'd said, every night she'd waited, every morning he'd woken up in places that weren't home. The frame was complete now. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. And somewhere between forgiveness and forever, between what was lost and what was found, that single photograph held a truth bigger than either of them, that some things are worth waiting for, even when the wait almost breaks you. So here's what I need you to understand. This isn't just a story about one woman and one soldier. This is about every time you've had to choose between what you want and what's right. Every time you've waited for something that felt like it would never come. Every time sacrifice asked more from you than you thought you had to give. That empty frame she stood in. You've stood in it, too. Maybe not in a wedding dress. Maybe not waiting for deployment to end. But you know what it feels like when life asks you to smile through the absence of what matters most. Now ask yourself this. What are you still waiting for? What frame in your life is still empty because you're too afraid to stand in it alone? What promise are you holding on to that's keeping you from moving forward, or worse, keeping you from being ready when what you've waited for finally arrives? She could have given up 1,000 times, could have told herself that duty and love can't coexist, that honor is just a pretty word for abandonment. But she didn't. And that's not because she was stronger than you. It's because she understood something most people never learn. That the wait is part of the story. That the empty spaces teach us how to appreciate the full ones. Here's your mission. If you're brave enough to accept it, stop waiting for perfect timing and start honoring the waiting itself. Whether you're waiting for someone to come home, waiting for your own breakthrough, or waiting to become the person you know you're meant to be, stand in that frame. Take the photo even when it feels incomplete. Because homecoming isn't just about arrivals, it's about what you became while you were waiting. The uniform folded on the chair, his boots by the door, the flag on the table. These aren't just symbols of sacrifice. They're reminders that some things are worth the wait, worth the tears, worth standing alone until you're finally standing together. If this story reminded you what real love looks like, if it touched something in you that needed to be touched, don't just scroll past it. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because there are more stories like this, more truths about sacrifice and homecoming and the space between duty and love that nobody else is telling. These aren't just videos. They're reminders that you're not alone in your waiting, that your empty frames will be filled, that the mission isn't over until you decide it is. Now go stand in your frame. The shutters ready when you are.